talking about classification and how organisms are classified into different groups based on shared characteristics or DNA. So what you are looking at here is actually a chart of the different characteristics of the domains and kingdoms that we'll be discussing in this video. So if you look at the top here, we have domain. And as I mentioned in our previous video, we have three domains that we'll be talking about. So we talk about a domain bacteria, domain Archaea, and domain Eukarya. Now, these contain different kingdoms as well within these domains. So remember I mentioned yesterday about how the classification scheme that Linnaeus created is kind of like a Russian nesting doll, where basically the domain is the largest nesting doll, and then the kingdom fits nicely in there, and then all the other taxonomic categories will fit into the one above it. So we have the most number of organisms in domain, yet when we get down to a species, we're only really looking at one type of individual or one organism. So let's get talking a little bit about these categories. So as I mentioned, we have these three domains here, and we have also in kingdoms, we have 6 kingdoms. Now what's interesting is that when we're talking about domains, especially the bacteria and the Archaea domains, they each only contain one kingdom. So let's take a look down here at the bacteria domain. Now, bacteria domain has only one kingdom in it, and that's Eukarya. Now, as we go down the chart, we're going to talk about this individually in other slides. However, I do want you to take notice about the differences between bacteria or domain bacteria and domain Archaea. So Archaea is another domain that only has one kingdom within it. Now, if you go down the list through bacteria and Archaea and kind of take a look at both of them, they're very, very similar. The only difference between bacteria and Archaea is that bacteria have these cell structures or cell walls with peptidoglycan in them. Archaea is without peptidoglycan. So this is the major difference between bacteria and Archaea. And that is very, 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 very important to understand and realize as we move forward. Now, if we take a look at domain Eukarya, notice that domain Eukarya has 4 different kingdoms. And these are probably a little more familiar to us. So kingdom Animalia, kingdom Plantae, kingdom Fungi, and kingdom Protista. And we'll talk about Protista and why it actually might be in these little quotation marks here. So let's get going on to our next slide. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about specific domains here and later specific kingdoms. But let's just kind of talk a little bit about domain bacteria. So I mentioned that it only has one kingdom within it. And if you look at the cell type, these cell types are prokaryotes, meaning that they are cells that have no nucleus within them. So pro equals no nucleus. And I mentioned the biggest difference between domain Archaea is that domain bacteria has cell walls with peptidoglycan in them. So domain bacteria, a lot of these bacteria need oxygen to survive. Yet some of them do not use oxygen to survive. So some of them are aerobic, meaning they need the oxygen, and some of them are anaerobic, meaning they don't need the oxygen. Now, most of these also reproduce through binary fission, which basically means, here's a picture over to the side, which basically means that the DNA is replicated within the cell splits in half, and then each cell now has a replicated portion of that DNA. So it's almost like just from this one cell, when it gets too large, it's going to split in half and is an exact copy of itself. And when I mean exact copy, I mean an exact copy. So the rest of these information here, like number of cells, it's always unicellular. Mode of nutrition, it could be an autotroph or a heterotroph, meaning that it makes its own food, or it has to get its food from somewhere. And examples that we have is Streptococcus. That's your strep throat. That's the bacteria that creates strep throat for you and gets you all sick. The other one is Escherichia coli, which is E. coli, which you may have heard about. This gets you stomach sick. So this is food poisoning. So if you ever have food poisoning, like a really bad case of it, it could come from E. coli. So let's take a look at domain Archaea. And I mentioned again the difference between this one and bacteria. I'm going to keep saying it because it's very, very important. The domain Archaea is also has one kingdom in it, and this is Archaebacteria. So these types of bacteria are called extremophiles. So they live in extreme environments, typically around volcanic hot springs, brine springs, meaning like very salty. Sometimes they also live deep within underneath the ocean near hydrothermal vents. And a lot of these can survive without oxygen. So they are anaerobic, meaning that they can survive without oxygen. They don't need it to survive. And they also, as I mentioned, they don't have the peptidoglycan, but they do have these unusual lipids that aren't found in any other organism. So they are pretty special bacteria. Now, a lot of times, again, we see these as unicellular organisms. They can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. And there's some examples, and these are the ones that typically live, again, around volcanic hot springs, or they might live deep within the ocean. Now, domain Eukarya has 4 different kingdoms within it, and all these kingdoms are eukaryotic cells. So they all have a nucleus within their cells. So this is where that split comes from the other 2 domains. So as we mentioned, domain bacteria and Archaea, they are prokaryotic cells. Domain Eukarya, these are all eukaryotic cells. So these 4 kingdoms contain eukaryotic cells. So let's take a look at what makes this domain different from the other 2. So let's talk specifically about the kingdoms now. So we know we're in domain Eukarya, and the kingdom that we're going to first talk about is Protista. Now you notice that it is in quotation marks, and this is because this is known as the dumping ground. Anything that doesn't fit in the other 3 categories, like your animals, your plants, and your fungi, typically is placed in here. I'm sure everybody has a kitchen drawer or a drawer in their house that holds everything that doesn't really fit anywhere else. That is Kingdom Protista. So if you take a look at some of the characteristics that we're going to see, they're always eukaryotic cells. The cell structures or the cell walls, they have cellulose. Some also have chloroplasts. They can be unicellular. They can be multicellular. Some of them are colonial, meaning that they live together, but they don't necessarily function together. Mode of nutrition, they could be autotrophic or heterotrophic. And an example would be an amoeba or paramecium. And this is an example of euglena that we have here. We also have giardia. Now, giardia is an example of something that can cause some stomach pain. It can cause some major stomach issues. So giardia is not anything that you want to deal with. You can get this by drinking unclean water. So I mentioned that it's the dumping ground. Almost all the kingdom Protista will live in water or at least will live in moist soil. So sometimes, though, it does live in the human body. And if this is the case, chances are it's a parasite. They do have many methods of movement. So some have cilia. Oops, sorry about that. Some have cilia and some have flagella. And those are means of moving the organism around. So we also see in Kingdom Protista, we see things called protozoa. Now, protozoa are also called animal-like protists. Now, they call them animal-like protists because they look, not that they look like animals, but they have some of the same characteristics as animals. So, for example, this type, protozoa, they actually reproduce sexually, meaning that they need 2 partners in order to reproduce. They're also heterotrophic, meaning that they have to go get their food from some source. So they have to find their own food. We also have protists called plant-like protists. And you're probably familiar with algae, that's seaweed, or the red tide that comes in is also can be considered algae. So algae is plant-like protists. They typically do not move. They either are planted into a substrate, kind of like this guy right here, this green guy, or sometimes it moves with tides and things like that. So this typically uses chloroplasts to photosynthesize, so meaning that it's autotrophic. And many algae are multicellular, so they have more than one cell within the organism itself. So as you can see, protists are very diverse is probably the best word. This is your junk drawer that we find in the kitchen. Everything that doesn't fit into other categories will fit here in the protist category. So secondly, let's talk about kingdom fungi. Now, fungi or fungi, I've heard it called many different ways. These are mushrooms. So you're most familiar with mushrooms or even yeast as an example of a fungus. So once again, this is in domain Eukarya. It's a eukaryote. These guys have cell walls made of chitin, and chitin is a very strong substance that will it'll hold shape. It's mostly multicellular, but we can see some single-celled fungi like yeast, and they're always heterotrophic, meaning that they have to find food somewhere. Now, fungi are considered to be decomposers. So a lot of times if you have mushrooms growing or if you see yeast around or something like this, there's something there that's decomposing. So they do a lot of decomposing on dead trees. If you go out walking to a forest, you're going to see a lot of mushrooms on things like that. In order to eat, they secrete digestive enzymes into their food sources through things called hyphae. So in this picture that we see here, it's not that the mushroom has roots. These are not roots like you think of in a plant. They are actually called hyphae. This is what they use to enter into or on top of their food source. And digestive enzymes will be released from these hyphae and it basically kind of liquefies the whatever food source they have. So they are able to absorb it within the hyphae and they bring it up through the mushroom. So this is their food source right here, or their food source, and this is how they get it through those hyphae. Kingdom Plantae. So these are your plants. You're very familiar with plants. We look outside our window, we see lots of green, especially in our summer times. So these, once again, are domain Eukarya, kingdom Plantae. They're eukaryotes. Now, plants have cell walls made of cellulose, which is different from chitin. And so one of the things that are different between the two, between fungi and plants, are those cell walls. Plants always have chloroplasts for the most part, and this allows them to make their own food from the sun. Most plants are multicellular. However, there are some algae. I know we mentioned algae in protists, but there's some green algae that is considered unicellular, and those fall under the plant category. They are all autotrophic, and some examples, meaning again, look out the window, mosses, ferns, flowering plants, your grasses, your trees, things like that. So one of the biggest differences, as I mentioned, plants have cell walls made of cellulose, whereas fungi have cell walls made of chitin. So this is a big distinction between the two because there could be, while plants are autotrophic and fungi are heterotrophic, that's another big difference. But if you were just to look at something, you'd be able to tell what one is just by looking at the cell wall, the cellulose versus chitin. Now, kingdom Animalia, probably the most familiar to us because we are part of kingdom Animalia. So once again, we're in domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia. Cell type is a eukaryote, so everything in Animalia has a nucleus within their cell. Now, kingdom Animalia do not have cell walls or chloroplasts in their cells. So we don't see this type of cell structure. Animals, or any organism in Animalia, is multicellular and they're all heterotrophic. And look around, you can probably pick out more animals than I have examples here. So sponges, worms, insects, fishes, mammals, you name it, chances are it is an animal. Now, it's actually really kind of interesting to know that there's a total of 35 phyla for animals. So all the organisms that are categorized in kingdom Animalia will fall into 35 phyla. There's a large diversity in kingdom Animalia. So we can see organisms that are tiny, maybe a few millimeters to many meters across. So the tiniest little worm versus the largest whale. So there's a large diversity in size. And animals live in all areas of the earth, land, sea, and air. And all animals reproduce sexually. So there is, these are those distinctions that you can make between other kingdoms. And I wanted to add this in here as well. We'll talk more about this as we move throughout the year, but all cells are organized into systems. So when we see kingdom Animalia, we do see more complex organisms as we move through. So all cells are made of make up tissues, tissues make up organs, and organs make up organ systems. We'll go into that in other units, but I just wanted to throw that out here in this part because it does help us understand classification a little bit. Now, just some characteristics of animals. We have, because we have such diversity, we actually have a wide range of characteristics that we see. Most of the characteristics, or most of the animals we see, actually do have a backbone. You can probably look around your house or outside and see birds and maybe some household pets like cats and dogs and other little critters. Chances are they have a backbone. But do know that 99% of kingdom Animalia do not have backbones. They're invertebrates. And many invertebrates have a covered hard protective covering on top of it called an exoskeleton. So if you look at lobsters or crabs or insects, they have an exoskeleton. So that protects them instead of an internal skeleton like we do, which is called an endoskeleton. So with that last 1% of those animals, those are the ones that have backbones. So those are the vertebrates, and those fall into one of the categories that we'll see soon, vertebrata. One question that I know you are wondering about right now is that are viruses considered to be living things? So I know I hadn't mentioned viruses at all in that classification scheme. So when we think of viruses, we can think of things that cause disease, like the cold or flu, HPV, also AIDS. But I also mentioned bacteria, which is living, that also can cause disease. So viruses are very different types of things. They are not considered to be living. And this is because they need a host cell in order to replicate. So they don't reproduce like we think normal organisms reproduce, either sexually or asexually. So they actually do need a living host in order to copy itself. So in this case, in this picture up here, this is kind of what a virus looks like. I mean, it looks kind of alien, and it does have DNA in it, but this virus needs to enter into a cell in order for it to replicate. So there needs to be a living host cell for it to do that. So once inside the host cell, that's when it can make copies of itself, and that host cell will then burst. And then once it bursts, it's going to spread the virus to other host cells, and that virus will infect other host cells, and then those host cells will also replicate that virus and burst and etc. So it's a big continuous thing. So when you get sneezed on, or when you maybe grab a door handle that has a flu virus on it, that's how it can enter into your system. And for humans, we have our immune system, which helps along fighting this, but sometimes it does get a little overwhelmed and we have some symptoms of that disease. So the answer to this question is no, viruses are not living things.